Chapter 21. Deborah believed that she was seeing a ghost, or a vision. Visions had at one time been common in Moriah, but with the exception of Daniel, Deborah had not heard of anyone having had them in recent decades. She had never herself had a vision, but she had always understood that they were accompanied by a profound peace and joy, and she certainly had neither of these. She felt fear as she watched the woman appear by the door. Whatever the woman was, she was beautiful, terrifying. She was tall and slim, with very fair skin, dressed all in white, almost like a bride, and even as the woman's image formed, she looked intently at Deborah. In time, the woman truly stood in the room, and Deborah was struck by the sense of commonality about it. The woman was as real as the wall behind her, as the pole which still sat below the window, and upon which Deborah had stumbled into a sitting position as she backed away from the apparition. But as material as she was, she seemed to emanate a strange sort of a glow, as though she were lit by a cool, white light from the inside. Except her eyes themselves seemed completely without light or reflection, cold and dark and featureless, and they stared at Deborah. Deborah wanted to close her eyes, but she did not dare. Her mind repeated over and over, "Please let it go away. Please let it go away." The woman came closer to her and said, "Why are you sitting on my pole?" Deborah stood suddenly, not having realized that she had been sitting. She knew now who the woman was. "Asherah, you have no place here." Asherah smiled. "By welcoming my pole into this house, you have welcomed me." "I didn't bring the pole here. I was trying to get rid of it." "It makes precious little difference now," Asherah said. "By the power of Moriah, I order you to leave," Deborah said desperately, as she backed deeper into the corner. But Asherah did not leave. Instead, she moved closer to Deborah. "You order me?" she asked, raising her eyebrows. "What do you know of power? Do you not know who I am?" "I know that you are a witch, and that you've been banished from this kingdom," Deborah said. "Please leave." "From ordering to begging." Asherah shook her head. "That is a sad turn." She was only 4 feet away from Deborah now, staring with her empty eyes. Slowly she raised a hand, and she began to stretch her fingers. As she did so, Deborah felt a stiffening in her body. She felt as though rods of burning iron were growing in her back and limbs. Her head began to tilt back of its own volition, so that she was looking towards the ceiling. Her arms and legs, too, began to stretch and stiffen, such that her arms were out to her side and back, and her legs were spread, and she stood only on the tips of her toes. Deborah then felt her body rising slowly, and could see the ceiling descend towards her. "By what power did you order me to leave?" the witch asked her, playfully rotating her in the air by some unknown force. Then, with a flick of her wrist, Asherah sent Deborah flying across the room, where her body slammed into the stone wall. On top of the pain of being stretched and stiffened, Deborah felt the full force of the impact and heard the splintering of bones. But no sooner had she fallen into a crumpled heap on the floor than once more she felt the stretching, stiffening, burning. Tears streamed down her face, but she could not cry or protest because she felt her throat tightening as though a bony hand were choking her. With her mind, she again called on the power of Moriah, and yet it was to no avail. She flew once more across the room, hitting another stone wall. This time she hit her head hard. Blood obscured her vision in her right eye, but she could not so much as wipe it away as Asherah maintained control of her limbs. The dragon stepped into the throne room with an air of familiarity. Eli noticed that it did not look so out of place in the throne room as one would expect. The dragon's scales were shiny and golden in color, metallic even. Its eyes were a deep, dark blue and looked almost like jewels encrusted in the gold. Above its eyes and down its nose and back was a ridge of small bumps, and each bump shone as though it had in it a crystal or even a diamond. Moreover, when the dragon smiled, if you can truly call it smiling, its teeth were white and smooth like polished ivory. Even its claws were like pearls. The overall effect was stunning, and Eli was not the only member of the council admiring the dragon. Dragons had always been portrayed in art as black or green and quite ugly. Moreover, they looked pleading and weak and notably evil, but dumb. But this dragon made the very throne room itself pale by comparison. The king was not one to lavishly decorate his own castle, though that would have been proper to him. What he did have were gifts from his subjects, who had fashioned his throne and Miriam's throne, the crowns, the tapestries, all out of love. But as tenderly and skillfully as these had been made, they looked clumsy and tarnished next to the magnificent creature. The dragon seemed quite aware of the admiration he received from the court. He held his head high and walked across the floor as though he were the king himself. However, when he came before the throne, he gave an ingratiating bow to the king and said, "Your Majesty." The king seemed impatient with it all. He was not at all interested in going through the regular rituals and courtesies. He looked at the dragon and said abruptly, "What do you want, Mammon?" The dragon almost seemed to snicker. "Relax, Your Majesty," it said. "I come in peace. No need to be so edgy." Then, when no one said anything further, it went on. "We've come here to form an alliance with you, but don't take my word on it. Listen to the girl." With this, the dragon moved its great clawed foot to push the girl he had brought towards the king. The girl was shaking with fear. She nervously held out a scroll, which she opened and began to read. She was shaky and nervous at first, but gained momentum, reading what was obviously a well-rehearsed and memorized letter. Your Majesty, but now it must be apparent to you and to your council that we dragons have assembled an army such that could utterly destroy your kingdom. They are camped just outside the village and are prepared to attack. You know well that this land rightfully belongs to the dragons, and has since the oldest times. While you, through your cruelty and impetuosity, have killed many of our brethren, you have also made many enemies among your own people. These, along with the giants and the Mazakim that you have exiled, have come together in a coalition such that your kingdom may well be overthrown and completely destroyed. However, to avoid this unseemly bloodshed, we have come seeking not war, but peace. We would like to form an alliance with you, one that would mean wealth and prosperity for all. With you as the king and the guidance of the dragons, we could unite in a more glorious kingdom. We are not asking you to abdicate your throne, only to share your power over the land and this people. We wish to meet in council with you to discuss the means by which the formalization of this union would be possible. You know, no doubt, that we have your daughter in our custody." As the girl read this line, Mammon looked at the faces of the council members to see if they knew that Sarah had escaped them. However, if they had this knowledge, their faces did not betray it. The girl went on. "Your daughter has agreed with us that this route is the wisest and most profitable one for all. Even she will fight alongside us should it come to war. But do not let it come to that. We know you are a hard and stubborn man. We give you until morning to give an answer. It is our hope that we can combine forces to make a greater kingdom than any that has ever been known. Your servant, Ra." The girl finished reading, rolled up the scroll, and moved to return it to the folds of her clothing. Melchizedek stopped her, saying, "Bring the scroll here, please." The girl hesitated, looking at Mammon, who nodded his assent, before she approached the king, handing him the scroll. "What is your name, child?" the king asked her. Again she hesitated before saying, "Magdalena." "That's a pretty name," the king told her, and she smiled. Then, handing the scroll to Eli, the king said, "Have this thing burned. I will not have such lies in my castle." At this, several council members protested, in particular Joab, who said, "With all due respect, sire, our armies are already decimated. We do not stand a chance against them. Man to man, we are vastly outnumbered, and they have dragons and giants and Mazikim, and who knows what else on their side. Our very survival may depend upon this compromise." "We do not negotiate with dragons," the king said firmly. "No compromise is possible. You cannot serve both me and dragons. You must choose which will be your master." "Your Highness, they have your daughter," Joab argued. "Surely for her of all people you're willing to bend a little." The king looked intently at Joab. "My son, you cannot serve two masters. You must choose. Will you choose to serve me or the dragons?" Joab realized that debate would get him nowhere. "Of course, I choose to serve you." Melchizedek then turned his attention to Mammon. "Return to Ra, and tell him that we will not serve him or have any part with him." Mammon sneered. "Ra told us you would reject the offer. Your stubbornness will bring your whole kingdom down around you. Come!" He snapped at the girl and turned to leave. "Magdalena stays," the king said. The dragon spun around. "What? How dare you? She's one of us, our messenger. You cannot take her prisoner." "I am not taking her prisoner. I am setting her free." Melchizedek was resolute. "She has not chosen you," Mammon said. "She's too young to choose," the king answered. "I have chosen her. Now go, or I will order the archers to shoot you in the courtyard." Mammon's eyes flashed for a moment, and he looked as though he would attack the king. But Joab, Reuben, Gideon, and Jeroboam each drew their swords, and so Mammon heeded the warning and left the castle in a rage. Chapter 22. Melchizedek instructed the council to try to get some rest, as the battle would likely begin in the morning. Reuben was to ensure that enough guards were on duty to defend the castle and to warn them if there would be an attack by night. So the rest of the men split up, each going to their own lodging. Magdalena was entrusted to Miriam, who was to look after her, get her cleaned up and fed, and find her a place to sleep. Solomon started back towards his own room. He was not sure what he would do upon arrival. Clearly it would not do to have Deborah locked up all night. Yet he could not risk letting her go just yet. He felt foolish. He had trapped himself. Undoubtedly she would be quite angry with him, so any requests for mercy would go unheeded. When he came to his room, he first knocked on the door. He felt this was a courtesy in case Deborah was sleeping in his bed. But there was no answer. He took his keys and unlocked the door and allowed it to open slowly, for fear that she may try to bolt or even attack him. But what he discovered was Deborah suspended in the air and rigid, her head bleeding, her right arm contorted in a very unnatural fashion. And there, standing before Deborah, was a beautiful woman in white. Her hand outstretched with palm facing the ceiling, her fingers slowly dancing. The woman smiled sweetly at Solomon and said, "Come in, Solomon. Close the door." Solomon did as he was told, but even while doing it, he asked, "What is the meaning of this?" "She is our enemy," Asherah said. "I've come to destroy her." "Who are you?" "You've served me all these years, and you dare to ask that?" Asherah asked. "Now, Solomon, be a good boy and kill your friend." Solomon suddenly felt desperately tired, like sleep would overcome him as he stood. He forced his eyes to remain open, and he exercised his jaw, opening and closing his mouth in an exaggerated and distorted way. He looked at Deborah, whose body shook violently with pain, and whose tears rolled down her cheeks. Yet her head was tilted up, and she gasped for breath and was unable to speak. "Put her down," Solomon said, staggering as the room grew dim. His head filled with a fog. He felt as though he could not complete a thought. He was being manipulated. He should run. Who was this woman? Run. She's beautiful. Deborah. Solomon leaned one hand out as he stumbled and caught the stone wall by the Asherah pole display with his left hand. Images of masks and carvings swam before him. His Asherah pole was missing. Solomon put his right hand to his temple and closed his eyes. "Solomon, kill her," Asherah said. Solomon opened his eyes, and there, amongst all of the other blurred images, he saw one thing clearly. It was a statue his wife had given him. "For your collection," she had said. It was a tall, thin gnome, about a foot tall. It was carved in wood and wore a long pointed hat. In the hat was a second face with gaunt cheeks and small jewels for eyes. But it was the main face of the gnome that was most hideous. Its mouth was open wide in a toothy grin, and it had wiry gray hair sticking out of its hat. Neither the hair nor the teeth were carved. They were real, from some animal that Solomon dared not identify. The novelty of the thing was that if you grabbed it by its carved hat, you could separate the top of its head from the bottom. The bottom became the base, and the hat became the handle, because as you withdrew it, it revealed a sharp blade carved of black stone. Solomon's wife had explained that the knife was used in ritual sacrifices in her home country. Solomon's mouth was dry. His heart raced. He felt a strange emptiness and pain in his chest, like tension and adrenaline, with this feeling itself prompted him to grab the knife. With the handle in his right hand, he took the base in his left and revealed the blade which caught the moonlight. He held it in his fist with its blade down. The fog in his mind seemed to be clearing now. He knew what needed to be done. He saw clearly Deborah suspended with her arms and legs and head back, offering him her neck and chest and abdomen. As he walked towards her, he felt panic rising in him and the thoughts, "Don't do this. Stop and think. Don't do this." But he resisted those thoughts. He knew that if he considered them, he would not do what he intended to do. He saw her neck, pale and beautiful in the moonlight, and he felt a rush of adrenaline as he slit her throat. Suddenly, the spell passed. Solomon saw that he had really done it. Deborah's dead body fell like a bloody heap on the ground. Solomon's hand held the blade and was warm and sticky with blood. He spun and faced Asherah. "You witch!" he shouted. "What did you do?" "I didn't do it. You did," she said. "Now you are one of us. You can never be a member of the kingdom." In a rage, Solomon raced at her with the knife, but suddenly he found that his feet were not on the ground. Instantly, his arms and legs grew rigid, and he felt a burning in them. He dropped the dagger and was thrown right past Asherah and into the stone wall, shattering his hip. As she had done with Deborah, she now began the assault on Solomon. Asherah raised him to the ceiling, and as she did so, she said, "You are one of us now. I can manipulate you like a puppet, or you can fight with us of your own free will, but you can never have any part of the kingdom. You belong to me." Solomon said nothing. Indeed, he could not. His throat hurt, his body spasmed. He tasted blood, but he could not even spit. His right hip was in excruciating pain, and his right arm felt like it should be hanging limp, but it was not. It was rigid and straight out at his side. From where he was near the ceiling, he looked down on Asherah, who seemed content to hold him there. He supposed she was giving him time to decide between being her willing slave or being her puppet. But as he watched, he saw behind her the door slowly and quietly open. He could not see who, but someone came into the room, quickly, brandishing a sword. The man took his weapon and ran it right through Asherah from her back and out through her chest. Asherah shrieked and clutched the blade protruding from her chest with her right hand. Then she fell to the ground, dead. No sooner had she done this than Solomon himself fell from the lofty ceilings onto the stone floor. As Reuben left the throne room, a young guard rushed up to him. "Sir, there's a problem in Hezekiah's tunnel." Reuben let out a long breath. He was tired and had hoped to get some sleep. "What is it?" "A man came into the castle by way of the tunnel. We're not certain if he is a spy or if he's with us." "Throw him in prison. We can work it out in the morning." Reuben began to head for his quarters. "But sir," the guard protested. "He has with him a young girl. He claims she's the princess, and I admit she looks like the princess, but Ratses says he saw the princess with the dragon. The girl's unconscious, sir, and looks to be in a great deal of pain. I was sent to find you or Deborah, but you were both in council, and I did not want to give away the end of the tunnel to anyone else." "You better bring her to me," Reuben said, foregoing sleep once more. "If she's a princess, I'll know." Just then a shout arose on the wall and in the towers. Reuben saw that his men had their bows taut, and yet none seemed to find a target. "They're on the move!" someone was shouting. "This is it!" "Curse those deceptive dragons," Reuben muttered as he ran up the nearest stairs to take a position on the wall. Below him, inside the courtyard, the people who had just begun to settle for the night were up and screaming and running all over. Soldiers, police, and guards grabbed their weapons and prepared for the onslaught. But outside the castle, Reuben could see that the enemy had no intentions of attacking them just yet. Instead, they were destroying the village, looting, smashing, and setting fire. Reuben recognized Mammon surveying the scene, and he realized that this was retaliation for the king's unwillingness to compromise and to work with the dragons. As a result, everything that anyone owned would be destroyed. The kingdom that had been offered wealth and prosperity would instead be economically ruined. Reuben had set his jaw firm as he watched the destruction. His own home was out there, his family's home. He had worked for years to build up a comfortable lifestyle, and now it would all be gone in this very night. He knew the greater battle was yet to come, but he felt the heaviness of this knowledge. All they could do was watch. The guards were prepared to shoot anything that came within range, but nothing did. Reuben saw even the statue of the king on the horse in the town square being toppled by ropes as men hacked at it with axes. He turned and saw that Melchizedek himself was watching from his balcony, just standing and watching, as they were all doing. Melchizedek had once fought for his kingdom, had provided for everything his people needed, but now he was unable to defend. Reuben turned back and watched as his beloved village burned. Jeroboam ran to where Solomon lay in a heap on the floor. He gently turned Solomon onto his back to allow for air. Solomon winced in pain and lay shuddering on the floor. He looked at Jeroboam and recognized the man who had once fought for Asherah. He closed his eyes. "I need to get you help," Jeroboam said. "Don't bother," Solomon answered. "I'm dying, and I'm not worth saving." Solomon turned his head to the side and coughed, blood splattering onto the stone floor. "The king will forgive you," Jeroboam assured him. Solomon smiled, a wry, weary smile. "I'm too far gone for forgiveness. Look what I did to Deborah." He feebly gestured to the place where the woman lay in a pool of blood. Jeroboam had not noticed Deborah until that moment. He paled, but again tried to reassure Solomon. "You didn't do that. Asherah did." Solomon coughed and sputtered, but did not answer. It was no use arguing. He knew that while he was largely influenced by Asherah, he had still cooperated with her willingly, had not allowed his reason to override her. He was too weak, and yet he knew somehow that if he had tried, he may have been able to resist. Jeroboam, seeing that there was no answer, said, "I'm getting help." "No," Solomon answered. "It's too late." As if in response to his words, screams and shouts arose from the village outside the window. Jeroboam ran to the window to see what was happening. Though he could not see the village, he could hear that men and giants were destroying it. Solomon went on. "I cooperated with her, with them. I am a part of this destruction. I will not have the king's men heal me. I will not be a part of this kingdom anymore. I will not be forgiven because I will not allow myself to be forgiven." Jeroboam continued to watch the destruction below. He remembered feeling roughly the same way when he came to the king. But the king had not only forgiven him, but had even given him an important post in the kingdom. Surely the king would forgive Solomon, even for murder. "I'm going to get you some help," Jeroboam said a third time. "You will be forgiven." But as he turned from the window, he realized that Solomon was already dead.